Chapter 23, 11th day of September, 1680. Part 1. Had Pierre's wisdom been written in ink on my heart, he could not have better predicted my fate. And so it came to pass that I was arrested and imprisoned for the writing of my book, for I was not as quiet about selling my book as I should have been. Now I stood once more before the court. My only hope was that I might rescue myself as before, for this time I had the assistance of counsel, though he pronounced himself wholly against me when we first met at my indictment mere hours before. The counsellor for the Crown, standing before the court, had the arrogant stance of a roost-cock that knew he was king only as long as others gave credence to his crow. "Mrs. Cellier, I warn you to think before you speak. Remember, any challenges you make will reflect upon you. It is this jury, once sworn in, who will pass their verdict on you." "Am I being tried for my life?" I said. If they needed a scapegoat, I would not be one, nor if I kept my head. Not if I kept my head. "No," the court clerk replied, and then, perhaps wary I did not understand the gravity of my case if my life was not forfeit, or perhaps that my reputation preceded me, added, "But think before you make any challenges." My old friend the Lord Mayor dominated the court in his carved wooden seat on a dais at the front of the room. In the case that I still misunderstood my position, he raised his leather spectacles and held the round windows to his nose. "Just watch how you challenge anything, Mrs. Cellier." He dropped his usual familiarity of the bench chambers for the sake of the court. "If and when you challenge, it must be for a reason." He did not fool me with his severity. His eyes were lit with anticipation that I would not only challenge, but challenge often. Why should he wish me to oil proceedings with timidity, when every coffee-house was full of his commissioned court transcripts, and none wished to read a dull account? Aware the scribes were most ardently scribbling every word, I merely nodded. They would have their story, no matter if I did say nothing. The clerk took the Lord Mayor's words as a sign to swear in the jury. Every man stood before the clerk was perhaps a tradesman, merchant, or labourer, and fidgeted with the awkwardness of a person in an unfamiliar role, or perhaps in a task that did not need him to use his hands as he was used to. I did not doubt that they would sooner pass this time earning a living in their own trade, but they would surely profit today by repeating every word against me to any that would listen. "I was one brought in to condemn the papist whore, but she was too quick to catch," they would say. Mindful of where I was, I fast hid the smile that crept upon my face from the men that purported to be my peers. In the usual order of things, the jurors were not truly my peers, for they were all of them men, and none of them Catholics. That was not to say that the fairer sex, so named with wisdom, but more so with wit, could judge me fairer. They might as soon nail me to the cross and place thorns on my crown, for midwives, though essential to childbirth, were often unfairly blamed for the pain of it. As well, some women despised that the midwife was oft used to catch those trying to outwit the law by pretending to be with child, if that midwife could not be bought. Nay, I would have no sympathy from one of my own. It was well the judges and jury were men. With little to spur them against me, I might succeed by taking the part of a poor hen pecked into writing my book against my own weak will. A more assorted band of men, though, could not be imagined. The first to be sworn was John Ainger. I could see nothing to either admire or despise, no eye contact. He disregarded me as I would him. The next one was another matter. His eyes stabbed me with hate that curled my insides. Even as the clerk said his name, "Swear Richard Boyce," I raised my arm over the top of the wooden bar and pointed at the man who had not yet taken his eyes off me. It was there in his eyes, the hate I saw in so many eyes, of both Catholics and Presbyterians, that wariness and distrust of something they not only did not understand, but did not wish to nor strive to understand. "I challenge him," I said. The clerk, uncertain what to do, looked not to me but to the Lord Mayor, who explained, "Mrs. Cellier, as I told you, you must be prepared to explain your challenge." As a child I had been on the wrong side. Then it was between Protestant Roundheads that wanted an unlawful government and Royalists, the Cavaliers, that wanted the rightful rule of the king. Self-professed good Protestants often pillaged my strong Royalist family home. This same look was in their eyes as they beat my brother and my father and treated my mother as a whore. As now, the source of hate then was ignorance and fear. If I only said I did not like the way the man looked at me, I would forfeit my right to challenge. But what else could I say? "I did not know that, my lord." There was little reason to aggravate one I might need later as an ally. The Lord Mayor asked me to repeat what I said because he could not hear me over the noise of the still rowdy court audience. Then my counsel, Mr. Collins, that when he did visit me before in jail, told me he did not wish to speak for such as an infamous papist as myself, said, "You cannot challenge anyone unless you have a cause." I bit down some words of reproof that he only advised me of that now, and repeated sweetly, "I did not know that, my lord. Then I agree he can be sworn." Some others sworn to the jury had the same look, as if they were given legitimate opportunity for revenge on all Catholics by judging me. I kept my mouth shut and my face calm. I did not wish them to know that they agitated me. One particularly obnoxious man put his hand around his neck, let his tongue hang out the corner of his mouth, and rolled his eyes in a gesture symbolising my imminent losing of the case, he hoped. I stuck out my tongue at him. My plan was contrary to his, though. Every person I spoke with warned me my plan was without hope. Even my counsel warned me ere we came that there were too many witnesses against me. His only instruction was to admit nothing, and that was my intention. With difficulty, I wrote my mind back to the clerk's speech. The clerk opened the case against me. "You gentlemen are now sworn into the court of law to try the case of Elizabeth Cellier, who stands indicted, wife of Peter Cellier of the parish of St. Clement Danes in the county of Middlesex." I looked to the people's area and found Pierre sitting motionless amongst lively men and women of the crowd, shouting out or talking between themselves. He had fought my being taken again, but he could not deny what I wrote when proof was held to his face in the shape of my book. But it seemed that, when they took me, they took his spirit too, and that was the hardest to bear. I nodded minutely to him. He barely acknowledged my sign, but I saw it, and it was enough for me. Meanwhile, the people of the courtroom hushed somewhat in order to hear the clerk proclaim the indictment. He wasted his life in this profession, and might have flourished on the stage. As before, he cleverly steered the jury against me with directions to find me guilty. "This woman of the Popish religion does not have the fear of God before her eyes, but is moved and seduced by the instigation of the devil. She has falsely and maliciously endeavoured to blacken the name of our sovereign Lord King Charles II, as well as the government of this kingdom, and also the true Protestant religion of this kingdom of England. Furthermore, she attempted to bring scandal and infamy upon diverse persons produced as witnesses, and that gave evidence against her, and other persons indicted with high treason on the 1st day of September in the 32nd year of our sovereign King Charles II. Mrs. Cellier did, in the parish of St. Clement Danes, in the county of Middlesex, falsely, maliciously, and seditiously write and cause to be written, imprinted, and published a scandalous libel titled Malice Defeated. Her proceedings, both before and during her confinements, are particularly related, and the mystery of the meal tub is fully discovered, together with an abstract of her arraignment and trial. She claims it is written by herself for the satisfaction of all lovers of undisguised truth. In this said libellous book are contained those false, feigned, scandalous words following, to wit: I hope it will not seem strange to any honest and loyal person of any religion that I, having been born and bred up under Protestant parents, should now openly profess myself of another church. In the case any lacked the wits to understand my words that were clear to any in this court, he looked to the judges and said, "She means the Church of Rome," before reading on. For my education was in those times when my own parents and relations were persecuted for constant affection to the king, that was himself murdered and the loyal party of the church destroyed, oppressed and ruined. It was said that the authors of these villainies were papists to make them odious, yet they assumed the name of Protestants, under which title they pretended to right all things. An understanding of this produced in me and more horror of that party that committed them, and made me curious of that religion to which they pretended the greatest apathy, wherein, thank God, my innate loyalty not only confirmed but encouraged me. These doctrines, agreeing to my public morals, commended charity and devotion to me. So, without scruple, I have heretofore brought myself in communion with both those who were humble instruments of His Majesty's happy preservation from the fatal battle of Worcester, and to those who, by a pretended Protestant principle, sought his innocent blood. And let calumny say what it will, I never heard from any papist, priest, nor layman anything but that they and all true Catholics owe their lives to the defence of our lawful King, whom I hope that God long and happily preserve as such. I hope these truths may satisfy an indifferent person as to the reason I first changed to the Catholic religion. The clerk cleared his throat as the court became noisy and waited for angry voices to quieten. He read on. Nor can anyone wonder at my continuance therein. She means in the Catholic religion, he again explained. For notwithstanding that the horrid crimes of treason and murder were laid at the feet of some persons of good quality and fortune in my party, my religion gives me satisfaction of honesty and honour. Certainly, when I reflected who were the witnesses and what unlikely things they deposed, and when I observed that many of the main sticklers for the plot were those, or the sons of those, that acted the principal parts in the last tragedy, I was convinced I made the right decision. I say those things made me doubtful of the whole circumstance, and the more I searched for the truth, the more I stopped doubting that the old enemies of the crown were again at work for its destruction. I, being confirmed in this, thought it my duty, through all sorts of hazards, to relieve the poor imprisoned Catholics that in great numbers were locked up in jail, starving for want of bread, and this I did some months before I ever saw the Countess of Paris, or any of those honourable persons that were accused or received 1 penny of their money directly or indirectly, till about the latter end of the January in the year of 1678. Though the clerk delivered the words of my book as energetically as any great orator, When he paused to measure the effect of my supposed libel on the court, it remained unusually soundless, and did not give any indication of their understanding of it. Still, he had not finished. He continued, "And in another part of the said libel are contained these false, feigned, and scandalous words, to wit: About this time I went daily to the prisons to perform those offices of charity I was obliged to, and on Thursday, the 9th day of January of that same year, I dined with the debtors in Newgate, in the room called the Castle, on the master's side. At about 4 in the afternoon, I came down into the lodge with other women, of which 3 were Protestants, and we all heard terrible groans and squeaks coming out of the dungeon they called the condemned hole. I asked Harris, the turnkey, what doleful cry it was. He said it was a woman in labour. I bid him put us into the room to her, and we would help her, but he drove us away very rudely, both from the door and out of the lodge. So we went behind the gate and there listened, and soon found it was the voice of a strong man in torture, and heard between his groans the winding up of some engine. When one of the officers of the prison came out in great haste, seeming to run from the noise, one of us caught hold of him, saying, "Oh, what are they doing in the prison?" He said he dared not tell us, and when I said, "'Tis a man upon the rack, I'll lay my life on it," he said, "'Tis something like that." Then I asked, "Is it Prance?" He replied, "Pray, madam, do not ask me, for I dare not tell you, but it is such that I am not able to hear any longer. Pray, let me go." With that he ran away towards Holborn as fast as he could. We heard these groans perfectly to the end of the Old Bailey. They continued till near 7 of the clock, and then a person in the habit of a minister, of middle stature, grey-haired, and accompanied by 2 other men, went into the lodge. The prisoners were locked up, and the outwards door of the lodge also. I set a person to stand and observe what she could. A prisoner loaded with irons was brought into the lodge and examined a long time. Some prisoners that were confined above crouched down as low as they could to the floor and heard the person examined with great vehemence. They heard him, in great agony, say over and over, "I know nothing of it. I am innocent," and "Will you murder me because I will not belie myself and others?" About 4 of the clock next morning, the prisoners that lay in that place above the hole heard the same cry again for 2 hours, and on Saturday morning again. Then about 8 o'clock that morning, a person I employed to spy out the truth of the affair did see the turnkeys carry a bed into the hole. They told her it was for Prance, who had gone mad and had torn his bed to pieces. That night the examiners came again, and after an hour's conference, Prance was led away to the press yard. This and many things of the like nature made me very inquisitive to know what passed in the prison. Soon after this, Francis Correll, a coachman that had been put into Newgate upon suspicion of carrying away Sir Godfrey's body, and lay 13 weeks and 3 days in great misery, came out. I went to see him and found him a sad spectacle, having the flesh worn away and great holes in both his legs by the weight of the irons, and having been chained so long doubled over that he could not stand upright. He told me much of his hard and cruel usage, such as how he had been squeezed and hasped into a thing like a trough in a dungeon underground, which put him to expressible torment, insomuch that he swooned, and that a person in the habit of a minister stood by all the while. He told me that a duke had beaten him, pulled his hair, and set his drawn sword to his breast 3 times, swearing he would run him through. Another great lord laid down a heap of gold, and told him it was £500 and that he should have it all, and be taken into the aforesaid Duke's house if he would confess that they would have him say. One F.A. Wittner, that lives at the sign of the Half Moon in Cheapside, by whose contrivance he was accused, took him aside and bid him name some persons that employed him to take up the dead body in Somerset Yard. The Lord gave him money for so lying, then told him that if he would do this, both F. and he should have money enough to get by. Mr. Correll also told me that he was kept from Thursday till Sunday without victuals or drink, having his hands every night chained behind him, and was all this time locked with a chain not above a yard long to a staple driven into the floor. In this great extremity he was forced to drink his own water for want of any drink given him. Furthermore, the gaoler beat Correll's wife because she bought victuals and prayed that he might have it. Then through the milk she took him onto the ground and bid her begone and not to look at her husband. The clerk raised his sharp little eyes from my book, and they leapt from one to another spectator in the still crowd, then swept from one judge to another. It seemed he did not know where to look, but perhaps he tested his audience, if they convicted me, as did he. For one thing I was certain, his eyes did not seek me, an insignificant actor in this play about me. I could barely keep from shouting, "'Tis not libel, if 'tis the truth." But uncustomarily restraint caged my word. I kept my face as an unwritten page. Patience would have my witnesses tell the truth of it all soon enough. I might be made to look foolish, but I was pleased that those things were read out in court. They would become talking points in the coffee houses and ale houses, and that would be no bad thing. Another part of the said libel contains, amongst other things, the clerk turned the leaves of my book and spoke to the court, these false, feigned, and scandalous words and figures following, to wit: in confidence of my own innocence, I continually pressed for my arraignment, so that I could know the charge against me, but I did not know the danger to my life of encountering the devil in the worst of his instruments, terrible perjuries encouraged by that profligate wretch Thomas Dangerfield, that hath since been exposed to the world in his true colours, both at mine and another trial thereafter. The clerk, still acting his part on the court stage, paused at the derisive jeers that started up then. Into his pause came shouts of, "Who knows the devil's instrument better than the devil's whore?" And "The cookpot dares to name the kettle black." Other shouts hid themselves in the rabble laugh that followed. When he had given the crowd the stage long enough, the clerk held up his hand towards them to reclaim it, and then continued the indictment in a raised voice. They quietened enough for me to barely hear him speak. The judges leant back in the seats, seemingly indifferent to the happenings that they presided over. Perhaps they also could not hear it. I felt certain they would call for silence, but they did not. "And in another part of the said libel," said the clerk, the rest of his words were drowned by another tumultuous swell. He repeated himself louder, with a pointed look at the crowd to quiet them, twitching, I thought, because he had dropped the reins of their sentiment he had failed to hold. "In another part of the said libel are contained these false, feigned, and scandalous words. Nor have I since received anything towards my losses, as the least civility from anyone whilst as a prisoner for rewarded rogueries, Dangerfield was visited by persons of considerable quality and great sums of gold and silver to encourage him to undertake new villainies, not against me alone, but also against good men, both Protestant and Catholic. People shouted out again, while the clerk turned to the place marked by his forefinger between the pages. He did not look up this time. He knew he had regained the reins enough and could now guide those behind the barrier whichever way he chose. Straight away, when he found the place he looked for, he followed his fingers with my words. I listened closely to make sure he did not put in anything I did not write, nor change any words place so it no longer said what I meant it to. He spoke the words as I wrote them, though he said them in a different way, moulding them into accusations instead of a record of what I had discovered. And in another part of the said libel, called A Postscript to the impartial readers, are contained these false, feigned, and scandalous words following, to wit, and whensoever His Majesty pleases to make it as safe and honourable to testify the truth as it has been made gainful and meritorious to do the contrary, creating hangman's hounds for weekly pensions or other considerations, we would not want for witnesses to verify far more than I have written. This evil and dangerous example of sin offends the peace of our sovereign lord the king, his crown and his dignity, said the clerk. Upon this indictment she has been arraigned and has pleaded not guilty unto it, and for her trial places herself in the hands of the country. So your issue is to discover whether she is guilty of this offence in the manner and form wherein she stands indicted, or not guilty. If you find her guilty, you are to say so, and if you find her not guilty, you are to say so, and no more. Now, hear the evidence. I recognised the junior counsel for the Crown, the one that opened the indictment, as a young barrister from Buckinghamshire by the name of Robert Dormer, Esquire, of Lincoln's Inn, near Paris House. From some at the Jesuit trial, I understood he, being not above 31 years of age, became a barrister a mere 5 years since. His family was distantly related to me, though my first husband that died at Leghorn when our children through my first husband that died at Leghorn when our children were mere infants. I was never formally introduced to him, since his family removed themselves from my circle when I married a second time. It was common knowledge he had not stood in a court many times before. He had the demeanour of a puppy on his first hunt, not sure of where he should find reassurance, half-done gestures, flashes of uncertainty that gave him away. His voice was not unpleasant, if a little staccato. May it please your lordships and the gentlemen of the jury, Elizabeth Cellier, the gentlewoman at the bar, the wife of Peter Cellier, of the parish of St. Clement Danes in the county of Middlesex, stands indicted of being the author and publisher of a libel called Malice Defeated, or a brief relation of the accusation and deliverance of Elizabeth Cellier. You have heard the indictments read. Some clauses of this libel are recited in the words that were written, in Mrs. Cellier's own words. I do not feel necessary to repeat every word to you. Gentlemen, within this book are contained libels as many different natures and against different persons and orders of men, as there are paragraphs. His Majesty, the Protestant religion, our laws, government, magistrates, councillors of state, courts of judicature, the king's evidence as well as the public justice of this kingdom are all defamed by the virulence and malice of this woman's pen. It was abundantly clear that whatever tenuous family connections we had, Mr. Dormer would allow me no mercy. Indeed, he was set to convict me. If his demeanour did not speak confidence, his words found approval with this audience, and if there were any that supported me there, they would be reluctant to speak for me for fear of retaliation. The noise of the crowd came down for want of hearing that I was charged with. This would be an important part of the tale to be told when they left here today. In her book, she casts aspersions on the principles of our religion, the murder of His late Majesty, and said Mr. Dormer, she accuses those that have done their duty and who are active in discovering the Popish plot as enemies of the crown, saying they reenacted the tragedy of our late civil war. She further charges our laws with cruelties as inhumane as they are false, in permitting confined prisoners to starve and in admitting the use of racks and tortures to extort perjuries and false evidence against the innocent. She libels those that give king's evidence, saying that they are devil's instruments or the hangman's hounds, and defames His Majesty's government in saying it is not safe to speak truth, but meritorious and gainful to do the contrary. You cannot fail to see her as the criminal she is, that has set her name to every page of this scandalous libel, and has since the indictment owned, published, and put value on herself for being the author of so excellent a book. To the indictment she has pleaded not guilty. If the king's evidence proves the charge, you are to find her guilty. The prosecution portrayed me as a despicable character, a devil's tool worse than any I had discovered in the Popish plot. I had seen enough of other trials to expect this, and had prepared myself for it, but still I might have convinced myself on Dormer's argument. How easily he twisted unwanted truth into evidence of foul play by the bearer of it. Mr. Weston spoke next. It seemed, twice told, he did not think that they fully understood, as he wished them to, as to why I stood before them. Next to my book on the table, he placed down a small stack of papers, very likely details he wrote to remind himself of them, then picked up my book. Gentlemen, the charge is this. First, she is charged with making this book, but there are several clauses in the book she is particularly charged with. The evidence we are about to show will prove, first, the book was owned and published by her, then, that the particulars charged in the indictment were in the book, and finally you will receive the directions of the court to sum up the proofs. It is your job to hear the evidence and see the proofs. Weston returned the book to its place beside the notes. Mr. Dormer, not the least happy to lose the ears of the court to Mr. Weston, wrote them back to his side with 4 words. We call our witnesses. The first to enter on behalf of the prosecution was the bone-thin William Downing, my publisher. He was ill at ease in the court, and apart from a quick look that acknowledged me standing at the bar, he was apparently distressed in who was there, as if he had been interrupted in another dozen things and wished to fast return to them. I fanned my face and tried to not appear out of sorts. This man took my money. We had passed several deep discussions on all manner of details about my book. I was tarnished with the existence of my book, and with or without his proof. He would not be my downfall, for what could he tell but that I had employed him? Besides, and slightly behind him, hobbled a man with a hooked gait I had seen before, but could not remember in what place. I knew the third person to approach the stand better than I should have liked. If I had doubted him, as I should have doubted any person coming to the door for my book, I would not be fingering cobwebs this day. This spider cast his web and made sure I stuck on it. As soon as he had my book in his hand, he wrapped me so tight-bound in my own conceit I could do nothing when he arrived with the law and made sure I came to trial. Catching a Catholic in his threads did not give him a robe of respect to the crowd any more than to me. They watched him with as much distrust as did I, for a spider does not change the way he builds a web and catches prey. Even the Lord Mayor looked at him with undisguised distaste. The three brought to the front of the courtroom were sworn in: William Downing, John Penny, and Robert Stevens. John Penny's name did little to enlighten me as to where I knew him. He must have felt my eyes on him, because he looked up and his eyes found mine and stayed on them. It was not maliciousness I saw there, only concern, an apology. He would have to speak against me, I knew, why else would he be there? But he was unhappy to do it. Chance was that he had been threatened into being there and saying what they would have him say against me. I swear he nodded so that only I could see. Mr. Dormer opened the questions by asking William Downing, "Please tell my lord and the jury what you know of the printing of that libel." Mr. Dormer held up my publication and then continued, "And who brought these sheets to the press?" Mr. Downing started to answer. "My lord, about the 22nd or 23rd of August," and was interrupted by that impatient fellow, Weston. "Begin with Penny first. Mr. Penny, tell us what you have to say about the book." So now this man would be revealed to me. He again looked to me before turning back to Weston and answering, "My lord, I was bid to buy a book of that gentlewoman, and I did so, having asked for her by name." And so he was one of the many who did buy a book from me. For what reason this man stood against me I did not know. Perhaps he needed none. "By what name?" "Mrs. Cellier." Weston pointed towards me. "Is that the gentlewoman?" Neither pause nor thought entered into the man's narrative. "Yes, that is the gentlewoman. And she came out of her house and asked me what my errand was. I told her it was to have a book. 'That you may have,' she said. I asked her, 'How much is it, madam?' She said 2 shillings. I asked her if I could not have any cheaper, and she said, 'No, I have sold them to shopkeepers for 18 shillings a dozen, and I must not sell them under that price to you.' Then she went and fetched me a book, and I gave her the 2 shillings, and then she gave me another little paper." Surprising me, because I thought it was the issue, Weston then said, "That is not an issue, nor your question now. Did you ask her for the book she published and set out?" Penny answered, "Yes, and she acknowledged it was her book." "So she owned the book and told you it was hers?" Mr. Penny held up my book. "This is the book I have in my hand, and I read every page of it," with which he looked at me and did not hide the respect he had for my writing of it. "And she told me there was another little sheet to be added to it, and if any gentleman wanted it sent to the country, it might be put in the letter and sent by post." I remembered that look it brought to mind when I saw this man before, when he had come to buy my book from my house. It was with respect and goodwill he had looked at me then too, when he had declared himself fortunate to meet the author, for he had said not many had so little fear for their life that they would lay it down for a book. I had little doubt that Spider Stevens must have seen him buy it from me and had followed him to make him a witness. Now I had remembered the meeting and the words that were spoken, I wondered if I might instil some doubt to my authorship. "May I ask him her question?" Weston said. "Tell me your question, and I will ask it." Why I could not ask it when the man stood right before me, I did not know, but I did know that the courts had strange rules from times long gone by, and I did also know that I did not wish to turn Weston any more against me. So agreeably I asked, "I desire to know if I said any more than you may have a book, or there is a book, and who asked for a book?" And then, as if I did not no longer existed to Weston, he repeated my question to Penny. "Did she say any more than you may have a book, or this is the book she had published?" Mr. Penny looked to the rafters and frowned in thought. "When I got the book and paid for it, I turned back to her and asked her if it was her own book. She told me it was, and more than that, if she had opportunity, she could have put more in it." His answer undid me after all. I had hoped to throw a doubt on his words, but they had become all too clear. Weston suddenly addressed me. "You did not deny writing this book yesterday, Mrs. Cellier. In fact, do you remember when you said if you could bring in your witnesses, you could prove the truth of it all, of what you wrote in the book? We told you the only thing you had to show to prove that you were not guilty was that somebody else had published the book, not you. Then you had said you had written it yourself, every word, with your own hand." "'Tis with regret I closed my mouth too late. Would that I had sewn my mouth shut before." "My lord, if I was a foolish, vain woman and spoke vain words about myself, which I did not understand the consequence of, I hope my vanity shan't be brought against me to convict me of a crime." "Mrs. Cellier, I scarcely think you would have been so careless as to say that of yourself if it were not true." He was right, but then I would not have carelessly written any of my book if it had not borne the truth, knowing I would as like find myself in the dungeons as pilloried. My duty was to expose the evil in the city, but I did not want to dwell further in jail for it. But I would go there if I must, for the sake of truth and truth alone, though I hoped it would not come to that. My husband, children and customers needed me. I should plead innocence, that was my chance. I appealed to them all as a woman. "But I hope you will not take vain words spoken in that foolish way as evidence against me." "That will depend on whether the proof shows you were guilty." He did not try to hide his distaste, and he wrinkled his nose. His countenance belied him as an objective examiner. He had no sympathy for me, and no subjugation would make it otherwise. I turned from Mr. Weston and again asked Penny to remember my exact words. "Did I say I wrote it?" Mr. Penny said. "You told me it was your book." "I told you? Please, my lord," I turned back to Weston. "Ask him on the oath he has taken. Did I say any more than it was mine and I sold it, not that I wrote it, nor that I was an author of it?" Weston did not, as I hoped, ask the question. Instead, he lectured me in exasperation. "Mrs. Cellier, this book is entitled with your name and sold by yourself. Now, in any judgment, this is both an owning of the book and a publishing of the book. When you sold it, you gave it out as your own book, and your name is on the title page as the author of it." I could not give up when my fate depended upon it, and when I had God and right on my side. "My lord," I said, "if I could produce my witnesses, I would make my defence, but I am informed that some of them cannot be found. They have looked for them everywhere, all over town, even as at Sir Joseph Sheldon's, and a great many other places, all to no avail." Truth be told, my man, George Grange, that had paid to find the witnesses, told me moments before the trial that many who would speak in my favour had disappeared. Why this was so was no mystery. It was common enough during a trial. Either they hid because they wanted no attention brought onto themselves for their involvement, or they were taken by those that had an interest too far from the city, so they could not defend me. Did Weston know of this? I suspected he did not, because he might have pretended to tell me to bring them, knowing they would not come. Instead, he was as a mule, putting me off having them there. To what purpose should your witnesses come? I held up my chin. I should have made my defence with them. Again, Weston referred to the previous day. If you had said yesterday you had witnesses to prove someone else wrote the book, we would have put off the trial. Crafty fox. He referred only to my having written the book and stayed far from the dangerous contents. If I proved the contents true, then it could no longer be called libel. But if he only proved I had written a book that assumed false contents, it would be called so. He continued. But you said you wrote every word of it yourself and so owned the issue. Now you pretend you want witnesses. To what purpose would you have them come? His was a bias so clear, it was a wonder he should be allowed to examine me. Surely he should not be allowed to question a witness when he was so determined to prove them wrong. I barely resisted telling him this. My lord, it is not for the bench to give evidence, and I hope you will not take advantage of vain words out of the court. I'll carry on tomorrow.